Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to tonight's Tom event, which is Messy Democracy, founding our nation to finding our way. Very relevant topic today. I'm Neil Piper. I'm the Executive Director at the Presidential Precinct, and we're just honored to partner with Tom on tonight's event. We're really delighted that you've taken time out of your busy schedules to be with us tonight. At the Presidential Precinct, we believe in the transformative power of visionary leaders to create thriving, just, and free societies around the world. And that's why we bring emerging leaders from around the world here to the birthplace of modern-day democracy, where 3 U.S. founding fathers, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, built friendships and convened to talk about democracy, rights, and the role of citizens. And while leaders are here, they draw an inspiration from one another at our 6 partner sites, which includes the University of Virginia, College of William and Mary, UVA's Mormon, 3 presidential homes, which are represented here with us tonight, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, James Madison's Montpelier, and James Monroe's Highland. And, over the past 5 years, we've hosted nearly 700 leaders from 128 countries here in Charlottesville, Virginia, Orange, and Williamsburg, Virginia. I'd like to give a special thanks tonight to our moderator, Sarah McDonald, along with our panelists, Leslie Green-Bowman, Sarah Bon-Harper, and Kat Hall, for sharing their insights and with us tonight on this really important topic. Sarah, Leslie, and Kat have been instrumental into the founding of the Presidential Precinct and our ongoing success as an organization, and so we're really thankful for them being with us tonight. I'd also like to thank American Evolution for sponsoring tonight's event. If you want to learn more about American Evolution, you can learn more about the 2019 commemoration events in your brochure. And I invite you all to join the American Evolution Innovation Cup, which is going to be at the Jefferson Theater on Thursday. But without further ado, I want to invite Paul Byer, which is the founder and director of TomTom. Paul?
Hello. How's everyone tonight? Good. Thank you, Neil, and thank you, all the panelists. If they start giving me rabbit ears, please let me know. I don't typically speak in front of the panel, give open remarks. But my name is Paul Byer. I'm the director of TomTom and the TomTom Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to TomTom. This is our 7th year celebrating innovation in Charlottesville and inspiring big conversations and big ideas in cities across the country. This has become an increasingly national event. This year we'll have 500 speakers coming from all over the country, including iconic innovators like Dan Rather and John Cleese, and Nickelodeon, New York Times, Washington Post. It's quite an assembly that we have been so fortunate that they will come to Charlottesville and inspire and engage with our community members here. I'm particularly pleased and honored that we could host this event tonight. And I wanted to thank Neil and Nancy and Drew and of course the distinguished speakers behind me with Monticello, Montpelier, and Highland sharing this important conversation with Charlottesville. And each year, TomTom partners with literally hundreds of organizations in Charlottesville to help tell a story about Charlottesville that is positive and forward-thinking to some of the values that Neil just alluded to, creates prosperity and equity in our cities and our civic discourse, and we could not have I could not be more pleased to partner with the Presidential Precinct tonight, and just wanted to thank you. And I think also, since TomTom is about founding, it's more about creativity and grit and how ideas start. We are so lucky to call Charlottesville home that's where we are, because this is, of course, the homes of the founding fathers. And that is Thomas Jefferson's birthday week is this week. It's a wonderful time for TomTom to be here. The events of August 12th are, of course, with us still. And I just wanted to make a brief mention of this, because TomTom has been spending a lot of time with this week program this year. We were, of course, the first event back in Emancipation Park in the fall after the Unite the Right rallies. It was really important to us to go back into that park and show that was not the image of this city, and it was that needed to be there. We're not a city of bigotry and hate. We have our problems and we are working to address them, but we're a city of innovation and culture and entrepreneurship, and it was important to go back into the park. And this year we're going to be back in the park this Friday, this Saturday and Sunday. So as part of Tom is the celebration and the fun of doing that. And part of it as well is in talking and having conversation. Some of the conversations at Tom this year will be about media and journalism. We will have an event actually with Gail Jessup White on Friday at the Jefferson Theater, a free community lunch on the Black experience in the public realm, looking at race and monuments in America. And then, of course, nights like tonight are so important because they help us understand our history and develop a shared understanding of our history and then how that relates to the future. And that's ultimately what Tom is about, is the future, the innovation, and finding ways we all come together and can look ahead. So, again, thank you so much. And Sarah, please take it away. And you all, thank you for joining us at Tom.
Paul, thank you. And I'm so glad to hear that you've been thinking deeply about the events of August 12. All of us here have, and in our conversations before the panel, we thought about how those events have inspired us to each use our talents to change the equation in some way. When I first saw that I would be moderating this panel, my first thought was how wonderful it is that we're all women. And Leslie at Monticello said, really, is that new news? Maybe not individually, but altogether, it feels different. If you've been in Charlottesville for a while, you can remember when that wasn't always the case. There's just some different kind of perspective, I think, that comes, and opportunities for sharing that are a little bit different. Then I looked at the presidents. We have the third, fourth, and fifth presidents of the young nation. Together, they occupied 24 years of the earliest generation of our nation's founding. And so I thought we'd start off with what we're calling a lightning round and ask each woman to describe what it is you want Americans to understand about the founder and his home that you curate now. And let me start with Sarah, who is at Highland with James Monroe.
All right, thanks. So, Monroe is the least known among these founding presidents, so it's a great opportunity right now to share his story. He was tremendously popular as a two-term president, such that he almost unthinkably today ran virtually unopposed for his second term, winning all but one of the electoral votes in 1820. He before that had a long string of elected offices at the state and national level, from member of the House of Delegates through governor, member of Congress, both in the House and in the Senate. He was Secretary of War and Secretary of State, and briefly at the same time Secretary of War, and then was a two-term president. So he was highly qualified. And in spite of that, his legacy is largely unknown, perhaps because of the complexity of explaining it, and his role in geopolitics, where he worked on relationships with European nations, territorial expansion, establishing fixed boundaries, and of course the eponymous Monroe Doctrine. So there's a lesson there. Put your name on it if you want to be remembered for it, which of course is an anachronism because it wasn't known till later. But our story at Highland is really exciting right now. 2 years ago this month, we announced to the public that we had made a major discovery, and that the House long interpreted, that is for over a century, as a remnant wing of Monroe's main house, turns out to be his presidential guest cottage. And we found archaeologically the remains of his 1799 main house. So it's a time of complete rediscovery, which is exciting for me, my background in research, for the public in looking in and saying, hey, history's not all written. Let's watch as this emerges. So that's the exciting thing for us right now. And at the same time, as we are rediscovering his Highland estate, those of you who are local probably know it under its old name Ashlawn, or the interim Ashlawn Highland, now known as Monroe's Highland, which was his name for it. So we're rediscovering that and also rediscovering Monroe.
Thank you. And Kat, tell us about what is happening now at Montpelier, James Madison's home.
Well, I'm going to ask, and for everyone who's on Facebook Live, they can wave at their screen, but I'd like to ask first, how many people have been to James Madison's Montpelier? And how many have been in the last 6 months? Well, that's pretty good. Thank you. Thank you, Leslie, for playing, for both of you. In the same way, James Madison isn't always as well known either, and it was always interesting to me to be in New York City and stop people on the street and go, Madison Avenue, do you know who that's named after? And people were completely blank, particularly millennials. But James Madison's... Sorry about that. But James Madison's Montpelier is really also at a very interesting intersection. And I think when we talk about the importance of why should anybody care about any of these guys, but in my case, James Madison, of course, he's known as the father of the Constitution and architect of the Bill of Rights. But, really, what does that mean? When we look at Madison's contribution and we think about our Constitution now 225 years old, and how it has continued to influence constitutional governments around the world, it really was a cataclysmic moment. And I would say Madison is the Einstein in this. He really is that political thinker about the Constitution. Things nowadays that we go, really, Madison did that? Didn't we always do that? People weren't used to this idea that you could have individual liberties and a strong government. People never had thought you could have government as large, that it would be swallowed up. And Madison says instead, wait a minute, factions, more and more diversity is better for us. Therefore, you won't have the tyranny of the majority. We're going to get to see this play out, aren't we, in our country? And also just this whole balance of powers between the federals and the state, and between individual rights and kind of the what we need as communities. All of this is amazing, and yet also at James Madison's Montpelier we go, it's not about ancestor worship, because the very Constitution that Madison and the founders wrote also from the very beginning codified slavery. So on our 2,700 acres, we also talk about the complete American story and how that's so much of our responsibility. The 300 people, the lives they led, the resilience they had, this very emotional and connected story, which we know because we've worked with the descendant community for 22 years. And the descendant community said, we don't want to be simply known as this monolithic labor force. We were mothers and fathers. We had children. We made a difference in this world. And if you're going to tell our story at James Madison's Montpelier, you better talk about the legacy of slavery today. So when you come, and we'll talk more about it, but we have a new and permanent exhibition called The Mere Distinction of Color. And we're continuing to pivot around this conversation on the Constitution because that is our shared lens. So that's a snippet of what we're doing out just a mere under 30 minutes away from here, if you drive really fast on Route 20.
There was a point where we talked about a marathon between us. I know. I think that would still be a great idea. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Paul. It's an honor to be here, especially with two friends and colleagues. You all know Monticello. It's on the nickel. It's in your pocket. It's more than a historic house, however. It's Jefferson's autobiography. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site with UVA's Academical Village. But it's also a museum. It's a research center. And I hope it's a place for Americans to find common ground. I think right now, in the divisive times we live in, I think all of our sites provide places where Americans can come for trusted sources of information. Americans have, in surveys, repeatedly said they trust museums more than fake news in newspapers, right? They don't say fake news, but that's my... So, we have, I think, an added responsibility to tell an honest and complicated and inclusive story. We learn more every year. History is never frozen. And I think one of the great delights of working at these sites is understanding the power of place and the power of discovery and innovation as we move forward. At Monticello, we feel it's the closest you can get to understanding Jefferson's words: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then understanding that those words were written in an age of slavery. And holding those thoughts in tension is something we talk about every day. We feel it's imperative that we understand and communicate to our visitors that we have much to learn from the past. We have much to talk about today that is a legacy of what our country was founded with, right? The original sin, slavery. Jefferson wrote the North Star for this fledgling nation and then couldn't live up to it. Failed, full stop on slavery. We are in a very exciting time right now. We've been able to take a 15-year project and compress it into 5 to really complete the restoration of the mountaintop. And it's the closest it's ever been to what those who lived there would have recognized. We've put back the landscape of slavery. We've put back the stories of many, many people. As Kat said, we know names, we know passions, we know marriages, we know trades, we know what happened after they left Monticello. And those stories are critical as well. So it's been a great honor and a privilege to be at Monticello in a time of really cataclysmic change. I think there's been more going on the mountain in the last 5 years than maybe the last 25 years put together. And we're approaching the end. So in the middle of June, we will celebrate the completion of the Mountaintop Project. And the last piece will include opening the South Wing, which includes Sally Hemings' quarters. It's a richer, more honest, much more dimensional portrait.
When you talk with your staffs, with your boards, with visitors, and with the descendant community of the enslaved people there, what sort of conversations do you have about how freeing and interesting it is to tell a more complete history of America's founding this way?
Well, I'll jump in on that one. I think August 12th gives you a real new light on that. So we obviously have been on a 10-year journey to restore the landscape of slavery. When I came to Monticello, they were full tilt finishing the amazing visitor center and museum. So everybody said, what's next? And very shortly after I arrived, I was up on Mulberry Row. Many of you know that's the dynamic industrial hub of the plantation, right, yards from Jefferson's bedroom. And a couple who are dedicated donors to Monticello and Montpelier, and I think probably Highland, recounted to me a story of having guests from Africa visit and standing on what just looked like a beautiful tree-lined lane and talking about Monticello. And the guests from Africa said, well, where were the slaves? It's as though that history's been erased. And that became for me, that first year that I was there, that sort of became for me, the drumbeat in my vision was already in motion, but that sort of said, wow. I already intellectually was interested in this. This became something very, very personal and emotional to get those stories back. And I think our board has been unanimously in support of it and never more proud of the work we do than knowing that this work matters. This work matters in a country today that's divided and has the racial issues it has.
I might build on that because we opened the permanent exhibition, The Mere Distinction of Color, on June 4th. And never knowing, of course, how could any of us know of the events of July and August. But the comments that we get both from visitors and the people that work there, people are fascinated by our origin story. As Americans, what do we share? It really is this Constitution, it's some of the founding father principles, and yet we all know that that origin story has never been completely told. And in fact, we were born in freedom and slavery, and people are fascinated. And it's not just a conversation for us as Americans and kind of a personal journey. It really is something that the national and international communities are looking to. So I think we have a fabulous opportunity, not necessarily to get ground down in the past, but say, what can we learn from the past and how do we move it forward? What are our responsibilities for equality today, for seeking of justice? How do we move that narrative forward as Americans? We have 2 movies as part of this exhibition and have recreated some of the enslaved dwellings. But when you go there, you push all the buttons and you hear the voices of the descendant community. And some of the conversations are pretty edgy. We talk about race and racist cops and rape, but we also talk about the incredible opportunities we have in a democracy. So I invite all of us to continue that conversation, as you said, Leslie.
Yeah, and Highland is a part of this and together with our colleagues from Monticello and Montpelier, and with Montpelier's leadership on how we teach slavery, we're in a really important conversation about co-authority and about the right way to engage in dialogue. Where do our stories come from and who tells them? And so these are really central issues to each of the sites, not only as museums, but also as the cultural institutions that are responsible for bringing people together on our shared, if you can say it in as unloaded a way as possible, our shared values as Americans, that this isn't just a story of these founding men. It's a story that's much larger. We often talk on site about going from sort of a portrait view. If you think of, our sites are historic sites because of these founding presidents. There's no getting around that. And you can think of sort of the old view as the portrait view, these founders in frames on the wall, right? And we're looking right now at sort of, you think of the Google Street View, right? The larger context of everyone who is involved there, and engaging the descendants of members of the enslaved communities at these sites is one of the pieces. And we are much later than you in doing that, but are doing that with a real shared commitment to what stories we tell and how we tell them, and finding out more about the shared history that we have.
May I ask you a question that I was just thinking about, and I'm not sure all three would have an answer? You brought up August 12th and how we're all struggling to think about the meaning of that. Are there any ways in which that connects, in your mind, more clearly to these men? And I don't mean, did they bring us white supremacists who were heavily armed to the streets, or did they carry torches and chant anti-Semitic chants? But can you draw a more powerful line for us to help us step back from Charlottesville and think about this, the great arc of history?
I think at the end of the day, what I walked away with, and I was here on August 12th, and it definitely was a pivot point for me in how I felt much more responsible for taking a stand, that showing up really does matter. And I think the founders showed up, right? They were the revolutionaries of their time period. They were really thinking about this very revolutionary idea of self-government. But what I think Madison said that I like so much is that justice is the end of government. Justice is the purpose of government. And you never have complete justice. Remember, it would have been white men with land who really would have had the rights under the Constitution as written by the founders. And yet we've created a document and a government that continues to evolve. We continue to expand justice. We continue to talk about equity. It is ever in the pursuit of. And that's what I would take away from the founders, and also our responsibility in the event of August 12th and what happens next. I'm really proud of Virginia. We had the founders here. We really started the nation, and maybe we've got the opportunity for that national conversation to really pivot around what we say here and do next year. And these cultural institutions are definitely a part of that.
I would add to that Jefferson believed that the documents that they created were living documents, that we were going to continue to shape this democracy, and that the responsibility of self-government is much weightier than the rights. I think we often forget that. We think about the rights. We as citizens don't always think about the responsibilities. And I think August 12th put that in very high relief. What are the responsibilities to shape and protect and advance a democratic society?
He not only thought they were living documents, but you reminded me, Leslie, that Jefferson actually tried to persuade Madison when he was writing the Constitution that it should be blown up every generation and written anew.
Yeah, Madison said, yeah, "I love you, man, but we're not doing that." This is no. He really did. It was they were the best of friends and had an amazing political partnership. And in fact, all three were towards the end of their life. But yeah, bad idea.
Another remarkable point is how young they all were when this was happening. So most of the founders who signed the Declaration of Independence were under 40. Some were in their 20s. Some people have called them the founding 20-somethings. Jefferson was the oldest, then Madison, then Monroe, right? Third, fourth, and fifth presidents. How do you see consilience with millennials today? They were the millennials of their time. How do you see consilience between them and what young people who are engaged in politics and change are doing now?
Yeah, go forth and I'll.
Well, if you think about it, young people have always moved society forward. There's no new story here. If you look at the founders, if you look at the greatest generation, if you look at the civil rights movement, over and over in history, that is the cohort that takes societies forward. And it's gutsy and it's risky, and that's the age group that's going to do it. So I think there's a wonderful story there as we look at coming towards our 250th anniversary and challenging that age cohort today. You know, we're 8 years away. What do you want America to look like in 8 years? Let's engage, let's shape, let's take charge. I'm too old. I can only inspire, I hope, and enlighten. But there are some amazing people in this room and around town and across this nation who have an extraordinary opportunity if we take history and bring it forward and remind them that it's not as confusing and messy as they think. There's an amazing opportunity here.
And I think that there was this opportunity back then that was a huge paradigm shift, of course, during the Revolutionary period. And we're having that same opportunity to have another paradigm shift. And I think you saw that on the March in Washington a week and a half ago, and you're seeing it on the ongoing conversations. And I think that people are looking to the United States to see what happens next. So it does feel, in an odd way, like 200 years plus, we're kind of going through maybe what I've talked about as the third revolution, which is really completely embracing our pursuit of equality and fairness and taking that next big step forward. We still very much are suffering, and I think August 12th was a sign of that, of the legacies of slavery, both mass incarceration, inequality, prejudice. It is still very much a part of our society, but it does not have to be.
Yeah, and I think if we are to think about the concept of disruption, it is often either the young who are not yet embedded in or benefiting from the status quo, who are willing to disrupt, or those for whom life is so hard that they just don't want to do it anymore, and they become disruptors. So if you think about the fact that change almost always has to come with disruption, we look at the young people who are ready to take it on. Those of us who get within the system, it's working for us, we found our ways, we may not be the best disruptors, and so it takes the young quite often to lead the charge in that way.
How much do you think the fact that they were from Virginia and from this place and lived lives of a certain sort influenced their ideas? Were they reading the same men? Were they reading the same philosophers and thinkers? Were they writing to each other about, listen to Hume, let's do this? How much did it matter also that there, between these three presidents, third, fourth, and fifth, that they weren't far from each other and they weren't mortal enemies? They knew and supported one another for the most part.
Yeah, I think that was big. It's big not only for us today, but big for them then. They all wrestled with the thinkers, what government was supposed to be. You know, Jefferson and Madison were famously fast friends in this intellectual realm. Monroe wrestled with the same philosophers of government, was the one who wrote a full-length treatise, People, the Sovereigns, about what government should and shouldn't be. And the fact that they had each other to bounce ideas off of, I think, strengthened all of their thinking in really distinct ways.
You know, it's the greatest political dynasty we've ever had in American history. So Jeffersonian presidents had 36 years in office out of 40. And no dynasty has lasted that long since. That's pretty powerful friendship and a pretty powerful alliance. Except for John Quincy Adams, it was Jeffersonian democracy for that 40 years. And I think that speaks a lot about the power of them as politicians and friends and intellectuals engaging on the topics of the day, and they were studying history and they were bringing it forward and they were sending each other books and opinions. Jefferson's in Paris just beside himself that the Constitution is happening, and he's probably 6-8 weeks away when a letter has to go, right? So it's easy for Madison to say, not doing that. But he's sending Madison, the latest treatises in Paris. He's finding books. They're sharing their libraries. It's an amazing intellectual crucible that these three men created. And I think that speaks hugely to politics today. Are we going to divide across the aisle? Are we going to talk and learn and listen and find common ground? And compromise was huge for these three men. They all understood it. They all understood the political stakes in play, and they knew that it had to happen.
The only thing I'd say about our world today and kind of the polity of it is that when you think about how the balance is supposed to be between the branches of government, and we focused a lot of people to talk about the Bill of Rights, and we're having really a moment in our life where the First and Second Amendments are clashing. We're seeing our branches of government not work particularly well. It'd be so fascinating to know if James Madison, Jefferson, and Monroe could fix that. Maybe because they had so much commonality. They were cut from very much the same cloth. They did have these long-term friendships that eased a lot of conversations. And what do we now expect from our politicians in terms of their sociability with one another? We are definitely lacking that today. So something, a lesson learned.
Can you remind us, for instance, Jefferson, speaking of slavery, we're in trouble. We have the wolf by the ears. Can you remind us of some of the other issues that we are grappling with today that frightened them, that they wrote extensively about, and that they talked to each other about? For instance, Madison worrying that we need a strong central government, but not too strong. If it's too strong, will Congress be weak? And will the president be monarchical? Issues of these lines, can you share vignettes or stories that make us feel a little better?
I'm going to, since Leslie referred to it, I'm going to talk a little bit about Madison before the writing of the Constitution. When Jefferson is in France, finally, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which everyone should read, it really was a world event in terms of, for the first time, really saying not only just toleration of religion, but freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. When finally Jefferson's away, Madison's able to kind of politic it through the Virginia legislature, and he writes his best friend saying, finally, I feel that we've really extinguished the ability to make laws for the human mind. And he is so fired up over that, and they're congratulating each other, as they should. This was indeed unique, to go even beyond toleration, beyond, in fact, the idea that you have the ability to have no religion at all. That's still controversial in a country that often tries to say it was founded as a Christian nation. So I think they had that energy, and from that, I always like to say I thought that's what gave Madison the energy to return to Montpelier, hole himself up in the little library, get the books from Jefferson that he's been whining about for several years, and really settle down and then write what becomes the framework for the U.S. Constitution, having beat Patrick Henry and finally gotten the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom through. And there are stories after stories after stories like that about these three men.
I think what makes, if you're looking for something that gives you hope, right, which we often do, I look at sort of the arc of Monroe's career, where they all come out of the gates, through the Revolution and after the Revolution, and at least some of them, I'll put Jefferson in this camp along with Monroe, are stridently partisan. Just vehemently so. The level of vitriol and anti-federalist, that is the idea of a strong central government and strong individual power in the federal executive, that just so vehemently, even unpleasantly partisan. at that time. I see Monroe's career growing through a period of great change, especially in the cabinet, in Madison's cabinet during the War of 1812, and coming out the other side saying, you know, it may be a Federalist platform, but we need a standing military rather than a militia. We nearly lost it right there. I was on the field at Bladensburg, and that was a mess, right? And so how do we fix that? And saying, well, our common cause is preservation of the young nation, and so let's bring that platform in. Well, you might need a national bank to fund that, so okay, you know. And so we see Monroe really embracing these platforms that were not of his early persuasion. And so by the time he's a two-term president, you know, he has John Quincy Adams as his Secretary of State, and is right there in sort of what we would today anachronistically call a transpartisan dialogue with what do we need to persevere here. And so seeing that change in someone over the course of a long career in public service gives me hope, and sort of gives us something to think about in terms of goals and what we can be committed to rather than our party politics.
I think that they all saw the importance of this fledgling nation and being American as more important than being partisan. So Jefferson's famous inaugural address after the most vitriolic election until the last one, 1800, you know, he begins with pacifying remarks. We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans, you know, we may differ in ideas, but not principles, right? So I'm paraphrasing. I think the thing that they all understood that maybe, with all due respect to politicians in the audience, we could nurture more in our current political climate is compromise. So the example I will give you is the dinner party, right? The room where it happened. Hamilton, the most famous foes among the founding fathers, right? Hamilton and Jefferson. How many of you have seen Hamilton? Fabulous. So you want to be in the room where it happened, and that was the room where it happened, and it was a absolutely standoff over just these issues. Hamilton wanting the federal government to assume states' debts, Jefferson and Madison wanting nothing to do with such a powerful federal government to which states would then be indebted. Sees Hamilton on the street, Hamilton's downcast, really, you know, all right, come to a dinner party. And this was Jefferson's great political maneuvering. He knew how to do a small private dinner party and get people talking. He learned it in Paris. The revolution is heating up, right? What's happening in Paris? Small political dinner parties. And so he and Madison and Hamilton are in a room where they all compromise. And because of that, Washington, D.C. is on the Potomac, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It always comes down to food.
Jefferson understood that, too.
We have a good deal of time to have audience questions, both online, if you're listening to the live feed, and from here. So have at it, please.
About a week ago, Madeleine Albright wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. I don't know if you saw it, but she talked a lot about the rise of fascism and the demise of democracy. What would you have to say to her?
Well, I'm very glad she stood at Monticello and gave a wonderful July 4th speech several years ago and acknowledged how important it was that these sites exist and that they bring history forward today.
I think all of the founders actually had that concern. They wouldn't have maybe necessarily called it fascism at that point, but to that point, you know, at that point in time in the world, what did you have? You had tyranny, right? Or you had anarchy, and no one really had understood that. Could you get this balancing part? That's always been the tension and the worry with the founders. Their second worry, right from the beginning, was they knew that slavery had been embedded into the Constitution, and they have all these different sort of, how are we going to get out of that? And they put provisions in, but they knew it was a flawed document, and I think both who's going to seize the power and how are we going to extend the power to a greater diverse part of the population was always there.
Yeah, that was a really powerful and stark piece that she wrote, and somewhat surprising, really, for someone of her stature to speak so starkly. It says a couple of things to me, primarily our individual responsibility. The fact that she stood up, that is, put her pen and ink out there, and said, we need to be aware of these signs of creeping fascism, which is the same thing as saying crumbling democracy. And, as we said earlier, being a disruptor is easy if you've got nothing to lose, right? But standing up as a person of great political stature, a great statesman, do we say stateswoman? A great stateswoman, Secretary Albright's remarks really should make us pay attention and should bring us back to our own individual responsibility. Where do we have the obligation to speak up? That's something I think about a lot in terms of history, and what it's easy to say what I would or wouldn't have done 50 years ago or 150 years ago. It's not so easy to say what are my responsibilities now. Should I use my public voice to say we need to be wary? And Secretary Albright did that. And so it is a profound statement from her.
And I think just to build on that, in terms of the cultural institutions, I think you're hearing all three of ours are doing something that maybe museums were not doing 10 years ago. We are, as cultural institutions, wanting to have a voice and have a place. If you look back just at the Jim Crow period and then the Civil Rights Movement, that gives me hope. A horrible atrocity, slavery, absolutely, and then this deadening effect of layering of laws and mass incarceration and all kinds of things, and yet, we just had Martin Luther King Day, we had a civil rights movement. In many ways, I feel like we're having a version of a rights movement again.
Right, and a time when we don't want to have people look back in 50 years or 200 years and say, what could you have done differently? Right. One of the things that I have been fascinated by intellectually is how did something as grave as the Holocaust happen? What was the rupture in society? And there was, in fact, very recently, within the past year, an exhibit at the Holocaust Museum that talked about individuals, what they did do and didn't do, their actions to prevent or to stop that creeping event or not. And so, let's look at what we're doing in our daily lives, whether it's our dialogue, our commitment to sustained dialogue, our reaching to audiences beyond the traditional ones, incorporating of multivocality, or making political statements.
I think Jefferson would say, because he did, of Americans, anything they can, they will. So I think he had great optimism, but he also had a great understanding of the importance of an engaged and educated citizenry. And this is a time, I think, he would argue for great vigilance.
Hi, first off, thank you for this panel. You've mentioned in two separate conversations now religion as well as tyranny. And I think at the time, religion was probably the primary source of tyranny. We oftentimes paraphrase the amendment as freedom of religion, but I think a more proper interpretation would be the freedom from religion. And I want to commend all three of you in your courage to tell the story of slavery in these institutions. But I would ask you, would you be willing to tell that story of almost anti-religion that was a reality of the forming of this country?
I'll take that on for a little bit. One of the things about telling the story about the enslaved community is increasingly we know so much more. And at Montpelier, for example, quite a few of the people who have been enslaved were literate or had access to literacy. We've also had this incredible archaeological record. And so there's a great deal of truthiness, I love that phrase, in the story that we're able to tell there. On the religious side, it is a little harder to decipher. I mean, Madison said that when he was talking about the Statute of Religious Freedom, that it's the freedom really of conscience, which was absolutely utmost to him, and that meant to him even the ability to believe no religion at all. But he went further than any of the other founders, as far as I know, in that area. But here you have Jefferson cutting up the Bible, and so they kept their religious beliefs very closely held to their chest. We don't have letters where they are, at least in Madison's case, really laying out. They felt that that was private and it was part of them. But it is not a mistake that the First Amendment starts with freedom of religion and freedom of speech. And I think those are two of the ones maybe most threatened sometimes in these current days.
Well, I think that the greatest fear was tyranny, whether religion or monarchy, right? And of course, they were conjoined in Britain. I find it fascinating that Jefferson is always upholding his agreements and his principles because he was willing to lose the election of 1800 rather than proclaim himself a Christian. And he steadfastly refused to answer that question. He was attacked as an atheist. He was vilified. You know, he's not cutting up the Bible till later, privately in the White House, to study the morals and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. But I think it's pretty profound to think of a man who has the leadership and the commitment to being willing to risk something that was very, very important to him, but he put his principles right on the line.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with any of that and don't have a lot to add except that I do really appreciate that question and we'll keep thinking about it. The freedom from religion, I think, is a very important piece that we do tend to gloss over.
So another question? What about how they experienced their own form of so-called fake news? That news was a real problem. Oh, do you have a question?
We're laughing.
Oh, that news was a real problem back then too, because it was not the sort of ideal of unbiased journalism that we had for a while here.
I'm going to grab this one because there's a great story, and there's some great examples, of course, with Jefferson and Madison. But in Madison's presidency, and actually before Madison's presidency, Jefferson was accused of pimping out Dolly and her sister Anna. And so when we talk about vitriol today, we haven't gone that far. So it was incredibly, as you said, Sarah, very interesting times and fake news. But on the other hand, James and Tommy went out and they bought a newspaper and they were producing their own news. So there's nothing new in the world.
Yeah. I think the idea that we only talk to like-minded people is perhaps one of the most limiting and dangerous for us. We have to get over the fact that we can meet with people that we disagree with and have civil dialogue, or if the occasion warrants it, uncivil dialogue, but at least dialogue, right? So the being able to come together to share news, agree on facts, right? Agree on events, that those are essential and fundamental parts of democracy. And once we stop talking to each other, once we stop agreeing on the facts, that's a really frightening point. But we need to find ways to to get together and have those conversations. One of the things that the founders disagreed on fundamentally was sort of the purpose and scope of government, right? We see this in, you've alluded, Sarah, to states' rights versus federal rights. We're still arguing about that. One of the key pieces that we're arguing about today is healthcare. I don't think most Americans think that people should go without health insurance, but I think the debate needs to come down to what's the role of government, right? And once we acknowledge that some folks agree that everybody should have health insurance, but it's not the role of government to provide it, versus we think that it's so fundamental that the government needs to ensure that everyone has it, right? To really come down and sit in the room and say, we can have an incompletely theorized agreement on what is the goal here, right? Good health care, right? And then can we all agree, down the next level, or maybe even the next level, but to sit and say, these are the things that we share, here are our values, here are our common goals, and then sit in the room and say, how do we get closer? And even if we can't reach down into the little dendritic pieces where, all right, well, strategy A, strategy B, and C, we can still agree that we share a goal. And what concerns me a lot, among many things, is that we've gotten past that point of being able to see, look, we all agree. We just don't agree how to get there.
If you think about it, the only thing that unites us as Americans is ideas. We're not a religion, we're not a conquest, we're not a tribe. Our history is only connected by ideas, some of which were coming from these three men that we represent, right? So I think that this, and they knew partisanship, and they handled it much better than we do today. But I think one of the things that I realized recently that we as historic sites contribute, that I bet none of you in the audience have thought about, is that in this age where you can curate your church and your school and your news and everything, your shopping, you can put yourself in a bubble and hear what you want to hear, right? On the internet, all of it. You can't do that when you come to a historic site and get on a tour. So every day at every one of our sites, we are actually convening conversations among people of very different persuasions. And I think that's really cool. And it's polite and it's civil, and they know there's common ground in history there that they want to learn more about. But on that tour, and I think all three of us make sure our tours are, they contain dialogue. They're not, we don't preach. We don't do that. We drive conversations. And when you think about it, when you sign up for a tour at any one of our sites, be right, left, and center, young, old, black, white, different religions, different nationalities. And we're going to convene a conversation across those lines. I think that's pretty cool.
Thank you.
One question that just came in from our live stream viewers, and that is just reflecting on all that these three men were able to accomplish, whether together or individually, and pairing that with this idea that Jefferson specifically gained his presidency with a very narrow margin. What parting words of encouragement might you give to young leaders and young entrepreneurs who see themselves in a similar position and are really fighting for this change in the face of margins like that?
I was in Morocco at the first Human Rights Conference since post-Arab Spring, 2015, and I felt like I was watching the Continental Congress all over again. There were delegates from all over the Middle East, and they all had to get special permissions and visas to go, and they'd never been in a room together because, of course, their governments didn't allow them to mix and talk unless there was an event that convened them like this, right? So I found myself sitting there just chills because they were the young lawyers and the young innovators and the young activists from across the Middle East that give you hope. And you don't hear their stories in the newspapers. You don't hear those stories in the headlines. But they asked me to give a keynote about the founders and about Jefferson. And I found myself so moved by listening to their stories and their troubles and their challenges. And it's very much what the Presidential Precinct is about, right, Neil? We're giving an opportunity for young emerging leaders to come and talk to us. This isn't about these three sites or our six partners telling them what to do. It's about convening the shared learning and lessons that we all have to do together. It hasn't been such an easy road in this country. We've made a lot of mistakes, and we obviously are continuing to do that. But we have lessons to be learned. But what I said to them when they asked me about the founding and their work, and I said, you have no idea how fragile this young nation was. You think of America as the most powerful country on the planet, and you think, oh yeah, of course, those guys, yeah, well, they got it right. I said, you have no idea how terrified and fragile and risky it was when these men literally put their lives on the line. Jefferson escaped the British and hanging by 30 minutes. I said, you just keep believing in what you do. Keep believing and talking and getting together and convening and move it forward.
The question really focused, and we've talked a lot about politicians, but I think we forget all the other people who are really upholding the Constitution in our government, and it's the teachers, and it's the police officers. So I would say don't just focus on that realm. And we have a Center for the Constitution at Montpelier, and we really are focusing on those people who every single day go out there and stand by this government that is we, the people's government. And I do really want to applaud the Presidential Precinct for bringing folks from other countries, because we're learning about their constitutional practices as well.
We just have enough time for everybody to maybe give us some closing thoughts, whether it be about exciting events you have planned at your site or processes of discovery that you're in now.
Well, Monticello's always been a work in progress, right? That's Jefferson's words, right? Putting up and pulling down. We're very, very excited about June 16th when we sort of unwrap the package and reveal the whole mountaintop completed in this current restoration. And we're inviting the largest reunion ever of the descendants of the enslaved. We've been doing oral histories for 25 years, and they've informed a lot of what we do. And our board is going to host them on the West Lawn for dinner. And the next day, we're going to open it up for the public to really celebrate everything from the textile workshop and the first kitchen to Sally Hemings' room, the landscape of slavery, the upstairs are furnished, a lot at the stable, a lot of exciting things going on. Come June 16th.
For those who don't know Juneteenth, because it was not a phrase I knew before working at Montpelier, it is when the last place learned about the 13th Amendment, and it was in June. So African American communities across the United States have celebrated this. It kind of went underground during the Jim Crow period, and it's gotten a big resurgence. And we too will be doing Juneteenth same day, so you can go to both places, exactly. Monticello and Montpelier on June 16th. But I think for us, continuing to build on the Mere Distinction of Color exhibition is a big part of this year. We still have more parts of that we are putting up. We're continuing to work with the descendant community. We've added a course on the Constitution. So if you'd like to come to Montpelier and dig deep on that document that is all of ours, you could be doing that. And with the Virginia Humanities, we're producing a podcast series to really dig into the conversations we've been having today. What matters now with constitutional interpretation? What are the burning issues facing us as a people? So that's what to kind of keep an eye on. And always fabulous walking at Monticello, but come out, we've got 8 miles too. Yeah, come visit us. We're so close, really.
Yeah, go to both and then come see us too. Right, so in the long term, look for us to continue this voyage of discovery, to continue rediscovering this plantation that somehow there was a presidential home that got lost and forgotten, and now we've rediscovered. Monroe's legacy, really exploring it in its full and rich context with sustained dialogue. Our relationship with the members of our descendant community is brand new. I'm very, very excited about it. We just yesterday launched a small-scale crowdfunding campaign to record oral histories of this group who lived through and made history in some really important times in the last decades. So really interesting there. We're really building our community. Highland is small. Our upcoming events include the opening of our rustic trails on April 28th with a public event that morning. And then we have several partnership events coming up, including our, again with Virginia Humanities, the Folklife Apprenticeship Showcase, a longtime favorite in Charlottesville that's been at Highland for the last couple of years, coming up on Sunday, May 6th. And our summer music series in the evening, Tuesday Tunes, is free this year. So one Tuesday evening a month starting on June 26th, we have that. So come and see that. Go to highland.org to learn more about our programs and about our events, our honey and mead tasting, as well as other things further out. So please do stay engaged, and we would love to see you.
And I can't not mention July 4th. So the Olympic moment at Monticello, if you've not been to the naturalization ceremony there, it's incredibly moving. And this year we'll have the Emancipation Proclamation on view from Juneteenth through July 4th.
Here to July 4th at Monticello, where the families cheer and huzzah each other, and you see the groups from different nations, and it's just It's the most reaffirming experience as an American. It's a reminder we take it so much for granted. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Blinding light. Good job.